The envelope sat on Anthony Hopkins's kitchen table for 3 days before he opened it. Mixed in with scripts and business correspondence, the handwritten address didn't look urgent. When he finally read the contents, Hopkins began to laugh at the beautiful absurdity of what was being asked. The invitation was simple. St. Mary's of the Valley needs one more baritone for Christmas Eve service. We know you probably can't come, but we thought we'd ask anyway. What Anthony Hopkins did with that invitation would transform a tiny Welsh village's Christmas into the most unforgettable night in the church's 400-year history. It was November 2008, and Margaret Evans, the 67-year-old organist of St. Mary's of the Valley in Margam, Wales, was facing a crisis. Her regular baritone, Di Williams, had suffered a heart attack in October and wouldn't be able to sing for months. 2 other men had moved away for work, leaving the small choir desperately unbalanced. The Christmas Eve concert was 6 weeks away, and she was looking at either canceling the choir's performance or drastically rearranging music that had been planned for months. St. Mary's wasn't just any church to the 400 residents of this small Welsh village. Built in 1604, it had survived wars, economic depressions, and the closure of the local coal mine. The Christmas Eve concert had become a symbol of continuity, drawing families from across the valley. For elderly parishioners, it was the one night when the church felt truly alive with music and fellowship. Margaret had been the organist for 42 years, watching the community shrink from over 100 regular attendees to maybe 30 on a good Sunday. But Christmas Eve always brought people back, former residents driving hours to attend, families planning their holidays around that single evening. The idea to write to Hopkins came during a frustrating rehearsal in mid-November. Tom Richards, her longtime tenor and the village postman, joked, "We need a famous baritone. What about Anthony Hopkins? He's Welsh, isn't he? From Port Talbot. Probably sang in a church choir growing up." Everyone laughed, but Margaret found herself thinking about it. Hopkins was from Port Talbot, less than 10 miles away. His parents were working-class, church-going people, the kind of family that would have been pillars of a congregation just like St. Mary's. That weekend, Margaret did something that surprised even herself. She sat down with her best stationery and wrote a letter directly to Anthony Hopkins, explaining about the church, the concert, their baritone crisis. "Dear Mr. Hopkins," she wrote, "I am writing from St. Mary's of the Valley, a small church in Margam, not far from where you grew up. I realize this is probably the strangest request you'll receive this month, but I thought you might understand what this little church means to our community." She explained about the Christmas concert, about the missing baritone, about the tradition that meant everything to a village that had lost so much else. "We're not asking for money or publicity, just wondering if you might know any Welsh baritones who might help out a village choir." She added a postscript. "My grandmother always said you never know unless you ask. At my age, I've learned she was usually right." Margaret sealed the letter with hopeful futility, telling no one what she had done. 3 weeks passed with no response. Then her phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon in early December while she was preparing dinner. The voice on the other end was unmistakably distinctive, precise, warm, with that musical Welsh accent that had made Anthony Hopkins one of the most recognizable voices in cinema. "Is this Margaret Evans of St. Mary's of the Valley? This is Anthony Hopkins. I received your letter about the Christmas concert." Margaret nearly dropped the phone. "Oh my goodness, Mr. Hopkins, I'm so sorry to have bothered you." "Not silly at all," Hopkins interrupted gently. "Actually, it's the most sensible request I've received in years. I've been thinking about it for days." What Hopkins told Margaret next sent her heart racing with possibilities she had never dared to consider. "I happen to be visiting Wales for Christmas this year," Hopkins continued. "My cousin lives in Swansea, and I was planning to be in the area anyway. Would you really want an old actor singing in your church choir?" Margaret was so stunned she could barely form words. "Mr. Hopkins, are you saying, would you actually consider—" "Margaret," Hopkins said, warmth evident in his voice, "I grew up in Port Talbot. I sang in church choirs from the time I was 8 years old. The church was my first stage, and it's still one of the most honest stages I know. I'd be honored to help if you think I'd be suitable." What Margaret didn't know was that Hopkins had been profoundly moved by her letter. At 70, with an Oscar, a knighthood, and more money than he could spend, Hopkins had been questioning what gave his life real meaning beyond professional achievement. Margaret's letter, with its complete lack of agenda and honest appeal to community service, had touched something deep in his Welsh soul. "When I read about this little church trying to keep their traditions alive," Hopkins later explained, "I thought about what really matters. A village choir struggling to perform carols on Christmas Eve seemed infinitely more significant than most of what fills my calendar." They spent 20 minutes working out practicalities. Hopkins asked Margaret not to tell anyone he was coming, partly for security reasons, but also because he wanted to surprise the community that had helped shape him. "I want to be there as Anthony from Port Talbot, not as some famous actor doing charity work," he told her. "This should be about the music and the community, not about me." They arranged that he would arrive for the final rehearsal on December 23rd. Margaret would keep the identity secret until he walked through the door. The secret nearly killed Margaret over the next 2 weeks. She told only her husband Gareth, swearing him to complete secrecy. Meanwhile, Hopkins was preparing in California, studying traditional Welsh carol arrangements and working with his vocal coach to ensure his voice was ready for choral work. On December 23rd at exactly 7 p.m., a simple rented sedan pulled up outside St. Mary's of the Valley. Anthony Hopkins stepped out carrying sheet music, wearing a comfortable sweater and genuine smile, looking exactly like a Welsh grandfather coming to help with choir. "Margaret, Anthony Hopkins, reporting for choir duty." Inside the church, 8 choir members were gathered around the old piano. Tom Richards, the tenor postman; Sarah Williams, the soprano section leader who taught at the primary school; Mrs. Jenkins, 83, who knew every carol by heart; young David Evans, 18, and nervous about his first Christmas as an official tenor. The moment Hopkins walked through the door, all conversation stopped. One by one, faces showed shock and disbelief. Tom Richards, mid-sentence, simply stared with his mouth open. Sarah Williams began laughing and crying simultaneously. Mrs. Jenkins sat down heavily and whispered, "Well, I never thought I'd live to see this day." "Everyone," Margaret said, trembling with excitement, "I'd like you to meet our new baritone." The silence was profound until Hopkins walked directly to the piano and began warming up with simple scales, his magnificent voice filling the ancient stone church. "Right then," he said after his vocal exercises, "I understand you need help with 'O Come, All Ye Faithful.' Shall we run through it so I can learn my part?" What followed was extraordinary. Hopkins was completely professional, taking direction from Margaret, asking questions about dynamics, working to blend his voice as if he'd been singing with them for years. More than his technical skill, it was his attitude that transformed the evening. He treated every choir member with genuine respect. He spent time with Mrs. Jenkins, asking about her 60 years of service. He encouraged David Evans, who was nervous singing next to such a famous voice. During a tea break, he shared memories of Welsh choir masters and early musical training. "The beauty of choir singing," Hopkins told them, "is that no individual voice matters more than the whole. We're all servants to the music, and the music serves something bigger than any of us." By rehearsal's end, the transformation was complete. Hopkins's presence had elevated everyone's performance by inspiring them to reach for excellence they hadn't known they could achieve. Word had leaked by Christmas Eve morning, despite efforts at secrecy. By evening, cars were lined up for half a mile. People had driven from across Wales and England to witness this remarkable service. The church, normally holding 80 people, was packed with nearly 200. People stood along walls, sat in aisles, squeezed together in ancient pews. Dozens more gathered outside around hastily arranged speakers. When the choir processed in at 7 p.m., Hopkins walked with the others, wearing the same black robe, distinguished only by the reverence he brought to every gesture. The service began with traditional carols, each lifted to unprecedented heights. Hopkins's voice didn't dominate, it anchored the others, providing foundation for every part to soar. During "O Come, All Ye Faithful," the harmonies finally achieved the completeness Margaret had envisioned. The moment everyone would remember came during Silent Night. Margaret had arranged for it to be sung in both English and Welsh. Hopkins took the second verse solo in Welsh, his voice filling the church with Dawel nos, sanctide nos, as he sang in the language of his childhood, connecting everyone present to generations who had worshipped in that sacred space. Time seemed to stop. 400 years of Christmas celebrations echoed in those Welsh words. It was like the church itself was singing, one attendee later wrote, like the stones and timber beams were all joining their voices to the human choir. After the service, Hopkins stayed nearly 2 hours, greeting every person who wanted to meet him. He posed for pictures, listened to stories from elderly parishioners who remembered his family from Port Talbot, and seemed genuinely interested in everyone he met. He was particularly patient with children, kneeling to their level, asking about their school choirs, treating each young person as if their questions were the most important things he'd heard all evening. Before leaving, Hopkins made one final gesture that sealed his place in the church's history. He quietly handed Margaret a check for £5,000. "For new sheet music and maybe a piano tuning," he said. "Please don't make a fuss about it. Consider it a thank you for letting me be part of something so beautiful." The story spread internationally within days, but the real impact was local and lasting. St. Mary's found itself revitalized. Young people who had drifted away began returning, drawn initially by the Hopkins story, but staying because they rediscovered community and purpose. The choir grew from 8 to 23 members within a year. Margaret, energized by the experience, began organizing interchurch concerts across Wales, sharing resources to help struggling congregations maintain their traditions. Hopkins stayed in touch for years, sending Christmas cards and following their performances. He returned once more in 2012, maintaining that focus should remain on community, not celebrity. "Anthony taught us that what we were doing mattered," Margaret reflected years later, "not because it was perfect or professional, but because it brought people together for something bigger than themselves." In a 2010 interview, Hopkins offered this reflection: "That Christmas Eve reminded me why I fell in love with performing. It wasn't about being seen or celebrated. It was about being part of something beautiful that served a purpose beyond entertainment. Those people gave me a gift that night, far greater than anything I could give them." Margaret's letter became folklore in rural Wales, cited as an example of the power of simply asking, of believing human connection can transcend fame and distance. Tom Richards framed the original letter in the church vestry with a plaque reading, "You never know unless you ask, Margaret Evans." The Christmas Eve service demonstrated that fame is most meaningful when used to serve community and tradition. Hopkins could have ignored the letter or sent polite refusal. Instead, he chose to show up, to stand with 8 other choir members and remind everyone that the most important performances aren't always on the biggest stages. This story reminds us that our most audacious requests might not be impossible, that famous people remember where they came from, and that sometimes the greatest gifts are ones we never thought to ask for. It shows us that true greatness lies not in commanding attention, but in using whatever platform we have to strengthen the communities that shaped us. If this beautiful story of unexpected generosity moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button for more hidden chapters about celebrities who use fame to strengthen communities rather than seeking personal glory. Share this with someone who needs reminding that reaching out with genuine need can yield miraculous results. Have you ever made an impossible request that surprisingly got answered? Tell us in the comments below.